Vasily Arkhipov. Vasily Arkhipov. With the exception of Carl, does anyone recognize that name? Fellow Toastmasters and guests, I wouldn't expect you to know that name. It comes from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's a true story. In the face of unimaginable pressure, this man kept his head, a cool head, and managed to save the world. In fact, probably most of our lives were saved because of him. So he was a hero. He was also our enemy. You see, he was a Russian. When's the last time you heard something good about a Russian? But it's a true story and a great story. And like all great stories, it has some lessons for life. I remember back in 1960, a man named John Kennedy was running for president. And one of the key issues in his platform was the ballistic missile imbalance. You see, back then, Americans believed that the Russians had a huge number of ballistic missiles, and we didn't have as many as they did. Now we know the truth. As a matter of fact, it was just the opposite. In 1960, America had 170 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Russians had less than a dozen. But that didn't stop their leader, his name was Khrushchev, from faking it. He publicly announced, "We make intercontinental ballistic missiles like sausages, and we'll continue to make them." The Americans were afraid. Now, those of you who were born at that time probably don't know how big an intercontinental ballistic missile actually was. It was a huge, hulking affair. It was so big, they kept it underground in concrete silos. And these concrete silos were located all over the United States in rural areas. We had the advantage without knowing it. And not only that, but our military actually put missiles, nuclear missiles, in Turkey, a NATO ally, in order to better target Moscow. Unbeknownst to Washington, the Russians had a counter plan. They decided to put medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. Their plan was to put 40 of them, and in so doing, they could target virtually any place within the continental United States from Cuba. Now, the reason they did this was twofold. First, to counterbalance the missiles we already had in Turkey, and secondly, to make the Americans afraid to invade Cuba as they had done earlier in the Bay of Pigs invasion. So that's what they did. And as these huge missiles went through the hamlets in Cuba, people noticed. And pretty soon, word had spread to the Cuban population in Miami. And after that, American intelligence found out. By that time, President Kennedy decided to declare a quarantine of Cuba. No naval ships entering toward Cuba would be allowed to land there. And so it was. In October of 1962, there was a confrontation, now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. A year before that time, in July of 1961, there was a problem on a Soviet submarine known as K-19. There was a nuclear accident. And one man, the second in command, Commander Arkhipov, was a man who kept a cool head. And because he did so, he supported the captain of that ship and prevented a mutiny of the men. And then he went into the engineering section to help with an overheated nuclear reactor. As a result of that, he was harmed by the radiation from that reactor. But then on the 27th of October, 1962, again, he was the second in command of another nuclear submarine. And the Americans had 11 destroyers and 1 carrier, the USS Randolph, tracking a nuclear submarine below the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And even though it was international waters, the Americans decided that they would pour depth charges into the water. What was the purpose? The purpose was to force that submarine to surface so they could identify it. But there was a problem. In that submarine, the K-59, they hadn't contacted Moscow for a whole number of days. In other words, they did not know if war had already broken out. And they were given permission by their leadership to launch a nuclear torpedo if the top 3 officers in that submarine agreed. So at that point, the captain of the ship decided, yes, we will launch. There's war. The political officer said, we will launch. Arkhipov said, niet, don't do it. Don't do it. And so, as you can imagine, deep within the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, there was this argument going on between the 3. And Arkhipov stood alone. Niet, don't do it. Eventually, he was able to persuade the captain to surface. The sub came up to the surface, they radioed Moscow for orders and headed for home. And the threat of nuclear war was averted. Now, the Secretary of Defense at that time, Robert McNamara, years later said, at that time, we didn't know how close we had come to nuclear war. Thanks to Arkhipov, the nuclear threat was averted. Thanks to him, millions of American lives were spared, and lives around the world were spared. And why? Because he had the wisdom of clear thinking. He was able to keep a cool head in a crisis. He knew what to do, and he forcefully argued for it. He was persuasive. Those are skills we learn in Toastmasters today. And the benefits are many. It benefited Vasily Arkhipov. Later in his career, he commanded submarines and groups of submarines and was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1975. He retired in the mid-1980s. He died in August of 1998, partly because of the radiation exposure he had in that incident in 1961. And by the way, that incident has been dramatized in an American movie named K-19, The Widowmaker. Thanks to him, we're here and we're safe. It's lessons that he learned, lessons that we can learn as well. Mr. Toastmaster.